In March of 1935, a British knight named Malcolm Campbell pointed the nose of a 4,000-pound machine called Bluebird at a stretch of Florida sand and ran it to 276 miles per hour. The beach was 500 feet wide. The sand was so hard-packed that at low tide you could walk across it and barely leave a footprint. 89 years later, a storm peeled away enough of that same beach to expose the wooden ribs of a 19th-century shipwreck that nobody knew was there. The sand had gotten so thin that the bones of forgotten things were poking through. That, in 2 images, is the story of Daytona Beach. There is a sign that arches over the road at International Speedway Boulevard where it meets the Atlantic, and the sign reads, "World's Most Famous Beach." It has read that since the 1930s. For most of the 20th century, the claim was arguably true. Daytona Beach was the place where the automobile proved it was faster than anything alive, where NASCAR was born in a rooftop bar, where 500,000 college students descended every March to do things their parents would rather not imagine. It was a city that lived on speed, spectacle, and sand, and one by one it gave every single one of those things away. The sand came first. Everything in Daytona starts with the sand. The beach runs 23 miles along the Atlantic coast of Volusia County, and what made it different from every other beach in Florida was its composition, a mixture of crushed coquina shell and fine quartz, packed so tightly by the tides that a horse's hoof or a tire rolled across it almost without sinking. The Timucuan people, who lived there for centuries before Europeans arrived, left no record of what they thought about the firmness of the ground beneath them. The British planters who arrived in the 1760s were too busy growing cotton and indigo to notice. But the sand was waiting. It had a purpose that nobody would discover for another 140 years. The city itself was founded on optimism and someone else's money. In 1870, a businessman named Matthias Day came down from Mansfield, Ohio, burning with the conviction that Florida was about to start over after the Civil War, and he wanted to start over with it. Day had made his money selling sugar mill machinery and farm tools, practical things, things that built economies, and he knew what the old Williams plantation land along the Halifax River could become. The Williams family had been British loyalists from North Carolina who fled to the Bahamas, then came back when Spain reopened Florida to outsiders. They grew cotton, rice, and sugar cane on a sprawling plantation until the Second Seminole War burned it all to the ground in 1835. The land had been sitting for 35 years when Day arrived. He bought 2,144 acres for $8,000, putting $1,200 down. He built the area's first hotel in 1874. He built 20 houses. He put up a general store and a post office. He laid out streets, platted lots, tried to sell a vision of a new Florida to anyone who would listen. Not everyone shared his excitement. By 1872, he had lost title to every acre. The land was repossessed. Day went back to Ohio and never returned. But the handful of people who had settled around his hotel and his store decided to incorporate anyway in 1876, and they named the town after the man who couldn't hold on to it. On the day of incorporation, the chief men of the settlement walked down the sandy trail they called Beach Street, under live oaks and tall palmettos, sweating, batting at mosquitoes, and gathered at William Jackson's little store to make it official. That might have been the first warning. Daytona Beach carries the name of a dreamer who went bust. For 2 decades, the town was a sleepy settlement of a few hundred people, reachable only by river. What changed everything was a railroad. In 1886, the St. Johns and Halifax River Railway reached Daytona. 3 years later, Henry Flagler bought the line and folded it into his Florida East Coast Railway. And suddenly, a place that had been a 3-day journey from Jacksonville was a few hours away. Northern tourists, the wealthy ones who wintered in Florida the way they summered in Newport, began arriving. Hotels went up. The most important was the Clarendon, built in 1888 on the beachfront at Seabreeze. It was the kind of sprawling wooden resort that the era demanded: oceanfront porches, a casino, stables for horses and carriages, a 1,200-foot pier jutting into the Atlantic. The Clarendon and an adjacent property called the Breakers merged in 1895, and for a time it was one of the largest hotels on Florida's East Coast. The winter season of 1909 was shaping up to be its best. Every room was booked. Then, at 5:30 in the morning on February 14th, a fire broke out. The hotel, all its cottages, everything, gone. 215 guests fled in their nightclothes. They rebuilt, of course. A new 7-story fireproof Clarendon opened on New Year's Day, 1911, with a Turkish bath, an 18-hole golf course, tennis courts, and something the old hotel never had: airplane exhibitions on the beach to entertain the guests. A pilot named J.A.D. McCurdy flew his biplane along the sand in front of the hotel, turned west over the Halifax River, and buzzed down Beach Street while clerks and customers emptied the shops to stare. Speed was already finding Daytona. In fact, it had already found it. In 1902, two automobile pioneers, Ransom Olds, founder of Oldsmobile, and Alexander Winton, who built cars in Cleveland, got into an argument about whose machine was faster and settled it the only way that made sense. They raced on the beach. The sand was so wide, so flat, so firm that it was like a natural drag strip paved by the ocean twice a day. Word spread. By 1903, when William Vanderbilt set an unofficial record of 92 miles per hour on the same sand, Daytona had begun to understand what it was sitting on. Not just a beach, a speedway. Between 1905 and 1935, 15 world land speed records were set on the sand between Daytona Beach and Ormond Beach, just to the north. The progression is staggering. In 1920, Tommy Milton broke 150 miles per hour in a Duesenberg. In 1922, a Norwegian immigrant named Sig Haugdal hit 180, 3 miles a minute, a phrase the newspapers loved. The cars got bigger, the engines more monstrous, and the beach kept absorbing it. In 1927, the British driver Henry Seagrave brought a machine called the Sunbeam Mystery to Daytona and set the record at 203 miles per hour, the first person to exceed 200 on land. The following year, Ray Keach recaptured the record for America at 207. Then came Malcolm Campbell and his Bluebird. Campbell was obsessed. He returned to Daytona year after year, each time with a faster car. In 1931, he ran 246. In 1932, 253. In 1933, 272. And in early 1935, the final Daytona record, 276.7 miles per hour, the fastest anyone would ever go on that beach or any beach. Here is the detail that matters. After that last run, Campbell decided the sand wasn't enough anymore. The cars were getting too fast, the beach too short, the surface too unpredictable. He took Bluebird to the Bonneville Salt Flats in Utah, where the course was longer and the surface was harder, and broke 300 miles per hour in September 1935. Every speed record afterward was set at Bonneville. The beach that had made Daytona world famous, the very thing that the name meant to anyone who followed speed, was abandoned almost overnight. The fastest men on Earth simply moved to a better surface and never came back. What happened next is the pivot that built modern Daytona, and it happened because of one man who was paying attention to the void. William Henry Getty France, everyone called him Big Bill, was a mechanic from Washington, D.C., who had moved to Daytona Beach in 1935 during the Depression to escape the cold and find work. He opened a car repair shop on Beach Street. He was tall, magnetic, and had the promotional instincts of a carnival barker and the business mind of a banker. When the land speed crowd left for Bonneville, France saw an opportunity where the city fathers saw a crisis. The local racing committee, scrambling to fill the gap, turned to a former speed record holder named Sig Haugdal, who suggested something new. Instead of one car chasing a clock, put a whole field of stock cars on a course that used 2 miles of the beach and 2 miles of the paved coast road, Highway A1A, connected by turns cut through the sand. The first race on this new beach road course was cobbled together in 1936. France entered. He finished 5th. For the next decade, he raced, promoted, hustled, and studied every flaw in the chaotic world of Southern stock car racing. The promoters who skipped town with the gate receipts, the rules that changed at every track, the drivers who never knew if they would get paid. He saw a business where everyone else saw a hobby. On December 14, 1947, France gathered 35 men, drivers, owners, promoters, mechanics, most of them with moonshine somewhere in their family trees, in the rooftop bar of the Streamline Hotel, a 4-story Art Deco building in mint green on South Atlantic Avenue, steps from the beach. The Streamline had opened in 1940 as a streamline moderne jewel, all curves and porthole windows, and the kind of sleek confidence that suggested the future was going to be wonderful. It had become a hangout for racers, celebrities, and assorted characters. You could look out the rooftop windows and see the Atlantic, see the beach where the speed records had been set, see A1A where the stock cars still ran. The men who gathered that December, Bob Richards, Freddie Horton, Jack Peters, Ed Bruce, a dozen others whose names survive in a single famous photograph, sat around tables with drinks and ashtrays and talked for 3 days about what stock car racing could become if someone organized it properly. France positioned himself at the head of the table. He was not subtle about this. They talked about rules, about guaranteed purses, about a point system, about building something that could last. When the meeting adjourned on December 17th, Big Bill France walked out as president of a new organization, holding 50% of its shares. As one of the men in that room, a driver named Raymond Parks, later said with a shake of his head and a grin, "Next thing you know, NASCAR belonged to Bill France." It was formally incorporated on February 21, 1948. The first offices were 3 blocks from the Streamline in the Selden Bank building. The first champion was Red Byron, driving for Parks. And the first great American motorsport was born in a Florida beach town, because the beach wasn't fast enough for the men who had been using it. But France wasn't done. The beach road course was thrilling and dangerous and utterly dependent on the tides, and France knew it couldn't last. Around 1953, he started planning something audacious, a permanent, high-banked superspeedway. Daytona Beach was struggling economically, which actually helped because the city fathers saw the gold lining and gave France everything he asked for. The city leased him 447 acres next to the municipal airport for $10,000 a year over 50 years. France raised money from a Texas oil millionaire named Clint Murchison, who loaned him $600,000 along with construction equipment. Pepsi-Cola kicked in. Harley Earl, the legendary General Motors designer, contributed. France took out a second mortgage on his house and sold 300,000 stock shares to local residents. Ground broke on November 25, 1957. The construction cost was $3 million. They had to excavate over 1 million square yards of soil to build the high banking, and the hole filled with water to form a lake in the infield. They named it Lake Lloyd, after one of the original members of the Speedway Authority. The first Daytona 500 took place on February 22, 1959. 42,000 people came. The finish was so close between Lee Petty and Johnny Beauchamp that it took 3 days of reviewing newsreel footage to determine the winner. The Daytona International Speedway was a triumph. It transformed American racing. But here is what nobody talks about. It also moved racing off the beach forever. The last race on the beach road course had taken place on February 23, 1958. Once the Speedway opened, there was no reason to go back to the sand. And the Speedway, deliberately, was built 6 miles inland, near the airport, not the ocean. The economic gravity of Daytona's biggest attraction pulled west, away from the beachfront, away from the boardwalk, away from the hotels on Atlantic Avenue. The very thing that had made Daytona famous, cars on the beach, was now cars in a concrete bowl surrounded by parking lots and chain restaurants in a part of town that looked like the outskirts of any mid-size American city. The sand still glistened, but the show had moved indoors. For a while, it didn't matter. The 1960s and 1970s were Daytona Beach's broad, comfortable middle age, and the city had enough going on that losing the beach races felt like shedding a skin rather than losing a limb. The Speedway brought hundreds of thousands of fans annually. The 1959 Daytona 500 had drawn 42,000, and by the 1970s, the seats were routinely full. Richard Petty won back-to-back 500s. The 1976 finish, in which Petty and David Pearson crashed coming out of turn 4 on the last lap, and Pearson dumped his clutch to crawl across the line in neutral, while Petty's car wouldn't start, became one of the most replayed moments in motorsport history. 3 years later, CBS televised the 500 live for the first time, and the audience saw Cale Yarborough and Donnie Allison crash on the final lap and then climb out and start throwing punches. NASCAR was becoming appointment television, and Daytona was its cathedral. Bike Week, which had roots going back to 1937, grew into a 10-day motorcycle rally that eventually attracted hundreds of thousands of riders. Main Street became a wall of chrome and leather and exhaust. Biketoberfest, a shorter fall counterpart, added another 125,000 visitors and $16 million to the local economy. Together, the motorcycle events gave Daytona Beach a second identity layered on top of the racing, a place for big machines and the people who loved them. The Peabody Auditorium, a 2,521-seat venue, opened in 1949 at a cost of $750,000, was named for Simon J. Peabody, who had donated the land and championed the original auditorium on Beach Street before it burned down in 1946, the largest fire in Volusia County history. The new Peabody hosted the London Symphony Orchestra every summer from 1966 to 2009, an extraordinary cultural draw for a city that most outsiders associated with engines rather than violins. There was a boardwalk with arcades, rides, and shops. The bandshell, built in 1937 as a New Deal project out of native coquina stone, hosted free concerts under the stars. Nearby stood the Coquina Clock Tower, 55 feet tall, with the letters DAYTONABEACH, where the 12 numerals should be, a quirk of design that had become one of the most photographed landmarks on the Florida coast. Beach Street, running along the Halifax River on the mainland side, was the commercial spine. Shops, restaurants, the kind of downtown where you could spend a Saturday afternoon and feel like a city was alive around you. And the beach itself remained open to cars. Families drove right onto the sand, parked facing the waves, set up their chairs and umbrellas, and spent the day 10 feet from their trunk. It was the signature experience. Your car on the world's most famous beach, the Atlantic stretching out ahead, a cooler in the back seat, kids running to the water and back. The beach was 3 to 4 times wider than it is today, according to people who remember the 1970s. You could spread out. There was room for everyone. There was nothing else like it in America. The trouble with having one signature experience is that when it changes, nothing feels the same. And the changes started coming, one after another, each one small enough to justify, large enough to matter. The first was the city's deliberate courtship of spring break. In the mid-1980s, the mayor and several hotel owners actively recruited college students, offering cheap rates and loose regulations to lure the crowds that had been going to Fort Lauderdale. Fort Lauderdale had cracked down on the mayhem. New open container laws, tougher enforcement, a clear message that the party was over. Daytona saw the opening and drove through it at full speed. The rates were cheaper. The beach was wider. The rules were looser. and the proximity to East Coast colleges, where most of the spring break demand originated, made it the obvious alternative. In 1986, MTV arrived. The network set up operations at the Plaza Hotel on the beachfront, the same property that had been the Clarendon back in 1888, rebuilt after the fire, renamed and reshaped through the decades, and broadcast 8 hours of spring break programming a day for an entire week. Bands played on stages built on the sand. REM performed at the bandshell. The cameras captured exactly what you'd expect and what the city had invited. Hundreds of thousands of college students in various states of undress and inebriation, doing things that would, in a later era, follow them on the Internet for the rest of their lives. Spring break is a youth culture event, MTV's Vice President Doug Herzog said at the time. We wanted to be part of it for that reason. It makes good sense for us to come down and go live from the center of it, because obviously the people there are the kinds of people who watch MTV. It worked spectacularly. By the end of the decade, Daytona Beach was the spring break capital of the world. The footage from 1989 is famous, or infamous, showing a level of chaos so complete that at least one hotel, reportedly the Texan, had to be totally renovated afterward. Hundreds of thousands of students poured in every March. The money was real. Spring breakers nationwide were spending an estimated $2.1 billion annually, averaging about $1,100 each. But so was the damage. The reputation that Daytona earned in those MTV years, drunk, loud, lawless, young, proved almost impossible to shake. It repelled the family tourists who had been the bread and butter of the local economy for decades. The hotels that catered to families couldn't compete with the hotels that catered to 19-year-olds with fake IDs. And when the cameras moved on, MTV shifted its spring break coverage to other locations through the 1990s and eventually stopped altogether in the 2000s. The students thinned out, but the reputation lingered. Internet search engines tagged Daytona Beach with the keyword spring break, and the tag stuck. Travel writers who hadn't visited in years kept writing about it as though 1989 were still happening. The city spent the next 15 years, and by its own accounting, millions of dollars, trying to kill the spring break image it had invited. Bob Davis, president of the Lodging and Hospitality Association of Volusia County, summarized the effort bluntly in 2024. We don't have spring break. That's been gone for years. We spent millions of dollars to change that. If we get 15,000 college students during the spring break period, that is a lot. We don't have college spring break. We have family spring break. It took us 15 years to wipe that out. But wiping out spring break left a gap in the calendar and in the cash registers, and what filled it was not families. What filled it, increasingly, was unsanctioned events promoted on social media. Takeovers, they were called, that brought thousands of people to the beach with no permits, no organization, and no one in charge. In March 2026, Daytona Beach declared a state of emergency after more than 100 arrests in 2 days during one such takeover. The police chief went to city commissioners and told them it was time to stop marketing Daytona Beach as a spring break destination entirely. The city that had once begged MTV to come was now begging the crowds to leave. Then there was the beach driving. In March 2000, the county closed a stretch of beachfront between International Speedway Boulevard and Auditorium Boulevard to all vehicles, opening a parking area with 1,500 spaces instead. The developers who were building the Ocean Walk Resort Complex and other beachfront properties had argued that cars cruising the sand in front of their hotels lowered property values and discouraged the upscale tourists they wanted to attract. A county councilman at the time put it plainly: if you want to do quality, you have to provide a quality experience for your guest, and that does not entail having a bunch of cars parked in front of the hotel. The logic was impeccable from a real estate perspective, but from the perspective of the businesses along Main Street and the beachside commercial strip, it was a disaster. The connection between beach driving and foot traffic was simple and direct. When families drove onto the beach, they passed through the commercial district. They stopped, they bought things, they ate. When beach driving was removed, the traffic vanished. One local business owner estimated that more than 200 businesses closed and 500 residents left the immediate area after the 2000 ban. Main Street, the beachside corridor that runs perpendicular from the beach into the commercial district, hollowed out. Storefronts went dark. The ones that survived often opened only during Bike Week and Biketoberfest, shuttered the rest of the year. An 84-year-old building at 777 Main Street, a structure that had been at various times a moving and storage business, a Harley-Davidson dealership, and a motorcycle saddle shop, sat mostly empty, used for T-shirt storage. The city eventually bought it for $3.1 million and spent years trying to find someone to turn it into a brewery or a public market. The building was constructed in 1939. It has never been less useful. In December 2025, a proposal to restore beach driving to the closed stretch came before the Volusia County Council. Residents and business owners packed the meeting. A brewery owner from Main Street pleaded, "This isn't just about having cars back on the beach. If we get beach driving back here, we have the potential to get mom and pops back on the radar. Without that beach driving, I believe that's why we lost well over 200 businesses." A city commissioner said he wanted Daytona to be a family tourist destination that we once were, but admitted we have a reputation to overcome. The council voted to reject the proposal. Under state law, once beach driving was removed, restoring it would require the Florida legislature to pass a special law. Nobody expected that to happen. And beneath all of these decisions, the spring break courtship and rejection, the beach driving ban, the speedway pulling economic gravity inland, the beach itself was changing. The sand that had once been 500 feet wide at low tide was getting narrower. Storm after storm chewed at the shoreline. Hurricane Ian hit in September 2022. Hurricane Nicole followed 6 weeks later, and the erosion was savage. Oceanfront homes, condominiums, and hotels sustained damage as the beach simply disappeared beneath them. Seawalls that had been built to protect properties turned out to accelerate erosion on the surrounding beach, an irony that geologists had warned about for decades. In early 2024, a nor'easter stripped 10 inches to 2 feet of sand from the beach in a matter of days, closing 14 vehicle access ramps and leaving wooden walkovers dangling above sand that was no longer there. The county's coastal director said it was the hardest hit the beaches had taken since the 2022 hurricanes. A geology professor at nearby Stetson University recalled watching the beach near the pier shrink dramatically when he was a teenager in the early 1990s, a process driven, he believed, by the very seawalls that were supposed to save it. The beach that was once so wide you could race at nearly 300 miles per hour is now in places barely wide enough to lay out a towel at high tide. And then there is what happened to the city around the beach. Daytona Beach's violent crime rate between 2015 and 2019 was the highest in the state of Florida, 1,229 violent crimes per 100,000 people. The current rate sits around 928 per 100,000, roughly 3 times the state average. The city ranks in the bottom 10% of American cities for violent crime. TripAdvisor reviews of the boardwalk and pier describe open drug use, limited police presence, and aggressive panhandlers. The boardwalk itself, once lined with arcades, shops, restaurants, and a movie theater, is a shadow. Visitors report repeated stores selling the same merchandise, rides that appear closed, vacant land where buildings used to stand. World's most famous beach, one reviewer wrote. Well, it used to be famous for its boardwalk, but now there is not much left to it. Many of the arcades, shops, and restaurants have been bulldozed away. There is a lot of vacant land. The median household income in Daytona Beach is about $52,000, well below the national median. The poverty rate is over 20%. Nearly 18% of all housing units sit vacant. Beach Street, once the commercial spine of the city, needed a security patrol program in 2024 because business owners reported that a growing homeless population was driving customers away. The city spent $25,000 on a 60-day pilot to put security officers on the sidewalks between Orange Avenue and International Speedway Boulevard, a stretch that in the 1950s and 1960s you could have walked from shop to shop without a worry in the world. The population numbers tell a different story than you might expect. Daytona Beach has actually grown from about 64,000 in 2010 to over 72,000 in 2020, with estimates pushing past 85,000 by 2024. But much of that growth is in areas far from the beachfront, and the demographics have shifted. It is no longer a city where tourism dollars drive everything. The Speedway remains enormous. A $400 million renovation completed in 2016 turned it into the first motorsports stadium in the world, and the Daytona 500 generates an estimated $2 billion in economic impact for the region. But that money concentrates around the Speedway and its adjacent development, One Daytona, a 181-acre complex of shops and restaurants that opened nearby. The beach side, the original heart of the city, has been left behind. Mary McLeod Bethune understood something about Daytona Beach that the promoters and developers never quite did, that a city's worth is in what it builds for people who have nothing. In 1904, she arrived from South Carolina with $1.50 and 5 students and founded a school for the daughters of African American railroad workers in a rented house near the railroad tracks. The Ku Klux Klan reportedly threatened the school. Bethune stood vigil to protect it. The school grew, merged with the Cookman Institute in 1923, and became Bethune-Cookman University, one of the most important historically black institutions in the South. Bethune herself rose to national prominence. She was appointed to government positions by 2 presidents and became one of the most influential black women in American history. Her home on the university campus is now a museum. She is buried there. The Campbell Hotel on what was then 2nd Avenue, now Mary McLeod Bethune Boulevard, was the only hotel where black residents and visitors could stay during segregation. Jackie Robinson stayed there in 1946 when he integrated minor league baseball at the nearby City Island ballpark. Dizzy Gillespie played there. It was the center of a black commercial district that sparkled, as one resident's mother used to say, with excitement. In 2025, the city purchased the Campbell Hotel with plans to demolish it. Residents formed a group to save it. A local historian named Harold Lucas, Jr. said the building might be worth preserving, but added a caveat that applied to the entire city. It might be worth saving, but not just for its historical value, but for the value of the community, because urban renewal came through and tore other things down, and they haven't replaced them yet. That line, "they haven't replaced them yet," is the sentence that keeps echoing through Daytona Beach. The city has been tearing things out for decades. It tore out the spring break crowds and replaced them with nothing. It tore out the beach driving and replaced it with a parking lot. It tore out the boardwalk shops and replaced them with vacant land. It tore out the downtown fabric and replaced it with security patrols. Each removal had a reason. Each reason made sense at the time, but nobody ever replaced what was lost with something of equal or greater pull. And the result is a city with a famous name, a famous sign, and a growing feeling among visitors that the name and the sign are relics of something that no longer exists. The Streamline Hotel is still there, 140 South Atlantic Avenue, 4 stories, mint green, Art Deco curves. You can book a room. The rooftop bar where NASCAR was born has been renovated and reopened. The Speedway is still there, 6 miles west, 101,000 seats. The bandshell still hosts free concerts on summer Friday nights, tribute bands playing Motown and disco to crowds sitting in the Coquina Amphitheater that WPA workers built in 1937. The clock tower still stands, 55 feet tall, The letters Daytona still marking the hours. But the beach in front of it is narrower than it has ever been. In December 2022, erosion uncovered the intact hull of a 30-foot ship from the 1800s, just north of Daytona Beach shores. A few months later, another wreck surfaced a few miles away. Hull lines 7 to 9 meters long, etched into the sand. The beach patrol captain who saw it said the discovery was exciting but unfortunate. It's kind of cool to see these blasts from the past, he said, but unfortunately it's due to the loss of sand. The sand. It always comes back to the sand. It was what made the beach hard enough for Ransom Olds to race on in 1902, and Malcolm Campbell to run 276 miles per hour in 1935. It was what drew the tourists and the racers and the dreamers and the spring breakers. It was what made the whole thing possible. Matthias Day, the man who founded the city and lost it, never cared about the sand. He cared about the river, the land, the lots he could sell. Bill France cared about the sand, but only long enough to realize he could build something better on dirt 6 miles inland. The MTV producers cared about the sand as a backdrop. The developers cared about the sand as a view from a hotel window, not as a road. And the ocean, which made the sand in the first place, has been taking it back inch by inch, storm by storm, tide by tide. There are people trying. The city bought $2 million worth of blighted property in 2024, hoping to attract developers. Beach Street is getting an $8 million makeover, new landscaping, wider sidewalks, reduced traffic lanes. The International Speedway Boulevard Beach Approach got a new 3-lane vehicle ramp in 2025 to ease congestion. There are plans for 300 new apartments on the downtown riverfront. Maybe it will work. Cities have come back from worse. But the sand doesn't care about redevelopment plans. It was there before Matthias Day and before the Timucua and before anyone called it the world's most famous beach. Last October, king tides and rough surf hit the Volusia County coastline hard enough to rip the wooden walkway right off the Ponce Inlet jetty and scatter the pieces across the rocks. Sand that had been dredged and pumped onto the beach in Daytona Beach shores to protect beachside structures simply washed away. A resident stood at the shore and looked at where the sand used to be. All that, she said, is just BS, really. The Coquina Clock Tower still faces the ocean. The letters still spell out Daytonabeach. Somewhere beneath the tide line, the ribs of a ship nobody remembers settle a little deeper into the sand that is still, for now, there.